scar is an area of fibrous tissue that replaces normal skin after an injury. Scar tissue is usually of inferior functional quality to normal tissue. In today's Africa, many nations still suffer from the scars of colonialism. During the first scramble for Africa, many modern African states were created on top of centuries-old empires, caliphates, and nations, thus fusing together many culturally distinct groups into these newly formed nations at the behest of the foreign invaders. As a result, one of the biggest causes of post-colonial conflict in Africa is the partition of pre-existing nations and the reconfiguring of ethnic nationalities not by common culture, as was the case in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. But these newly created nations were put together oftentimes according to European desires. As such, many of Africa's borders were not designed to accommodate Africans, but were designed to ensure European hegemony on the continent. These borders were created with little or no concern for the people actually living there or their heritage. As such, many African nations today are still suffering from the scars of having such entities put together over top of pre-existing African nations with little input of the people now forced into these new borders. One such nation to still deal with the scars of colonialism is Cameroon. For many nations in Africa, the legacy of colonialism cast a shadow over the continent. In Cameroon, the country is currently torn between the Francophone government and the English-speaking minority, who have put forth calls for separation. The origins of these issues Cameroon currently faces goes back to colonialism and the infamous scramble for Africa. However, more recently, in late 2016, southern Cameroon witnessed mass uprisings and demonstrations by Anglophone citizens who took to the streets to express their grievances, leading to calls for independence in 2017 when a group of English-speaking militants, known as the Amazonian Defense Forces, declared their independence from the French-speaking federal government. This group claimed that the country's English-speaking populations were politically, socially, and economically marginalized. Such protests led to a mass crackdown by the French-speaking government. These crackdowns, in turn, fueled an even stronger sense of identity politics. The question is how and when did two indigenous African groups become fractionalized along lines involving languages and identities foreign to both parties? I'm your host, Ebube Okoli. Welcome to Up Close and Center. On this episode of Up Close and Center, we will discuss Cameroon, its colonialism, and the problems that it faces today. As always, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell icon so that you'll be among the first to know when new content becomes available. Furthermore, if you have any additional analysis, please feel free to use the comment section. In order to understand how one country can be divided along such lines, we have to examine Cameroon's colonial past and Europe's role in the current conflict. Prior to colonization, Cameroon had many indigenous languages. However, none was dominant. With the development of trade and the installation of missionaries along the coast, a number of European languages began to gain prominence. In the mid-19th century, British missionaries reached the shores of what is now Cameroon. Thus, English laid the bedrock of a sizable population in what later became Cameroon. Simultaneously, during the notorious Berlin Conference, Germany also laid a claim for Cameroon. However, Germany's holdings were swiftly shattered after their defeat in World War I, resulting in the surrender of Germany's African colonies. With Germany out of the way, the coast was clear for Great Britain and France to pursue their own interest in the area that eventually became Cameroon. As such, Britain and France then split the Cameroon amongst themselves. France controlled most of the land in the territory and renamed that area East Cameroon, while the English-speaking territory by the Nigerian border came under the British control and was renamed West Cameroon. In addition, adding a further level of complexity, the British-controlled West Cameroon and the French-dominated East Cameroon had completely different forms of colonial administrative government. The British colonial system primarily kept the power in the hands of the local rulers. Thus, as with many British colonies, Africans were appointed to govern over other Africans. Conversely, the French colonial overseers took a more direct, heavy-handed approach in directly ruling most areas of people activity. For example, the French colonial administration directly collected taxes, oversaw the courts, and ran the educational system. They also determined how the economy was to function. France's heavy-handed approach had the aim of cementing French culture, a French worldview, French traditions, and the French language into the African psyche. Therefore, the French-governed Cameroon was less autonomous than the British-governed portions. After several decades of very distinct colonialization patterns, two Cameroons were born. British Cameroon would remain Anglophone in culture and worldview, while French Cameroon became an extension of the French Empire and had a worldview aligned with French interests. In 1960, with pressures mounting for the colonial system to be done away with, the French government formally granted Cameroon its political independence. However, the British-governed Cameroon was given two options in a simple referendum. The choices they had were either join the newly independent English-speaking Nigeria or unite with the rest of Cameroon, language differences aside. Despite the local desire for a fully sovereign nation called Ambazonia, such a choice was not offered in the referendum. This was due to the fact that Britain did not believe that an independent state of Ambazonia would be politically or economically viable. Accordingly, the United Nations removed the independence option from the referendum ballot. After the votes were counted, a portion of English-speaking Cameroon voted to join Nigeria, while the rest of the English-speaking Cameroon joined the Independent Republic of Cameroon. Although English-speaking Cameroon shared language, cultural ties, and heritage with their brothers in Nigeria, the local elites feared that their region would lose all the autonomy to a much larger nation. Thus, in a bid to preserve their local autonomy enjoyed under the British, joining a smaller nation of French-speaking Cameroon simply made more sense. During unification, the English-speaking Cameroon left the discussion believing that they had been promised a new constitution to be part of a federal system, where all constituent federalized states would maintain their autonomy. However, something very different actually happened. What occurred instead is that French-speaking Cameroon promulgated a system that concentrated power in the French-speaking federal government. Thus, the only concession the English speakers got were merely legislative seats. These seats ensured some representation but differed from what the English speakers believed they had originally bargained for. As such, believing they had been misled by their French-speaking countrymen, and feeling that the British had now abandoned them to their fate, the English speakers accepted this agreement with great trepidation. However, just a decade after unification, the French-speaking president had a change of heart, partially due to his French advisors. These advisors persuaded the French-speaking president that he should push for absolute authority over both sets of speakers. Accordingly, the French-speaking president's government amended the constitution, creating a new system with a unitary state. A unitary state is a state governed as a single entity in which the central government is ultimately supreme. Unitary states stand in contrast with federations. A federation is a group of states with a central government but independent in internal affairs. Therefore, under the unitary state, power was further centralized in the Francophone capital. Moreover, English-speaking Cameroon was split into two smaller administrative divisions that now all had to report directly to the French-speaking presidency, thus dividing and whittling down the autonomy of the English-speaking southern Cameroons. Soon after, the French-speaking federal government enforced a series of anti-English reforms. These reforms included measures that forced the English speakers to sever all ties to the United Kingdom and the introduction of the Central African franc. Introducing this currency greatly reduced the purchasing power and wealth of the English-speaking citizens. As a result, decades later, the political elite of the English-speaking Cameroons became dependent on the French-speaking federal government for economic and political support. However, in November 2016, the English-speaking Cameroon's frustration reached a tipping point. Thus, uprisings erupted, therein resulting in strikes and protests that were met with violence and government-sanctioned internet outages. Ever since that time, English-speaking Cameroon's independence movement has grown to the point where secessionists have taken up arms against the French-speaking federal government. If great care isn't taken, this century may see the unraveling and dismantling of African nations that were corporately designated and created by Europe. Unless proper systems are put in place today that ensure that Africa's pre-existing ancient nations, civilizations, and empires, now contained in various nation-states, are handled in such a way where dignity, autonomy, and cultures are preserved and respected. This concludes our broadcast of Up Close and Center. As always, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell icon so that you will be among the first to know when new content becomes available. Furthermore, if you have any additional analysis on this topic, please feel free to use the comments section. Thank you for your time and your commitment to the continent.